Hi, everybody. People are all shifting from the previous talk to here. I'm just going to continue talking to introduce our next speakers and make that transition from the last talk. I think we've had a very good day so far about communications research, as I said before. In talking about how behavioral sciences can play a role in communications research, it's really thinking about how people are responding to advertisements, to marketing, to messaging, and also UX. So how people are interacting with different systems. So that could be through websites, or it could be through apps, or even in how they're using an actual product. You know, maybe it's a hair dryer, maybe it is a garlic press. I don't know. But, you know, that user experience that someone has, how can we measure what the consumer experience is without interrupting that behavior? That's the real question that behavioral science really is involved in when it comes to UX and consumer experience. So we're going to wrap up today, the second day of NeuroU. Thank you so much, everybody who's been able to join, and special thanks to all of the speakers that have been able to join us today. I think this has been really great. So finally, we're going to wrap up the day with a case study that's from a joint project that was with IVP and HCD, and it's going to be presented by Kathryn and Bob. Bob is someone you met yesterday during our Neuro Tools panel. So if you missed that, please feel free to go to the lobby and check out the talks from yesterday. They have been uploaded, so you can check those out. So he was part of that panel yesterday to really talk about those specifics. There was a question from the last talk, actually, that was talking about doing any of this type of research during COVID and how the procedures change. And Bob does a nice job about talking about that yesterday on that panel. So Bob, who you met yesterday, is president of IVP Research Labs. Kathryn is HCD's manager of behavioral marketing sciences, and HCD partnered with IVP Labs, Research Labs, to examine the usability of two COVID-19 vaccine scheduling websites using NeuroTools. Now, for those of you who may have tried scheduling a vaccine early on in the year, you may have noticed how difficult that was. There were a lot of challenges. And so we thought it was a really great way to use some of these behavioral sciences tools to really dive deep into the consumer experience as they're trying to navigate a website, where we found it to be a very great use case of how these tools apply. So if the speakers could come off mute so we can actually see you. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this screen so that we can pass it over to Kathryn, who's going to share her screen. Please feel free to type your questions in either the Q&A or in the chat. Tell us your experiences with any of these vaccine websites, and we'll be happy to talk more about it. So thanks so much. And without further ado, passing it off to Kathryn and Bob.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I just want to make sure everyone can see our screen. I'm going to assume that they can. It's our faces. But just again, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Kathryn Ambroze. I am the manager of behavioral and marketing sciences with HCD Research. And Bob, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Bob Granito, IVP Research Labs, and we are data collection specialists.
Awesome. Yeah. So I just want to thank everybody for tuning in really quickly. And we're just going to be talking with you about making a really good impression and discussing a little bit more into neuro-driven UX research. So hopping right into it, I know that this slide, if you are joining us from the previous presentation, it may look a little familiar, but we do want to focus on impressions because they are made in every interaction we have throughout our day, whether it's interacting at a store with an employee or using a product at home in your own daily routine. It's these small moments that help us build associations and make life easier. But how do we make these associations and evaluations? Most people assume it occurs through our explicit opinions, where it could be someone recommending something to a friend, or even if you really liked a product, you decided you wanted to go out and repurchase that product. But these impressions actually start to form prior to our first thought about them in our non-conscious. And the conscious and non-conscious are often thought of as a switch, where either you're sleeping and they're off, or you're awake and they're on. But it's actually really helpful to think about the consciousness as a continuum. And when you're going through an experience, you go through the experience, you go through the world experiencing things non-consciously, and then your brain processes that information until you decide how to act or behave with the information that your body had received. So maybe it's the smells or the sounds or even just textures in your environment that are going to be influencing your reactions. But when you're going through this, you do want to be considerate of, what is that smell? Why is that occurring? And it's really your brain that is what recognizes those signals and gives it value and gives it meaning. So as you deliberate and tease apart what you're experiencing, you're able to analyze the situation better, which then brings you to consciously react to it. And this happens in user experience all the time. We often use this example of when your cell phone rings. Before you are even aware that your cell phone is going off, there's a sound wave in your hair cells that causes things to vibrate in your ear. And that actually triggers a neural response that sends the signal to your brain in the non-conscious. And as your brain determines the meaning of, okay, that's a sound, that sound's coming from nearby. Oh, that sound is coming from a phone. Oh, that sound's coming from my phone. Then you start to put things together and you enter this space of consciously deciding if you're going to pick it up, or maybe you shouldn't pick it up. You're in the middle of presenting at NeuroU. So it's things like that that you want to consider, that a lot of things are being experienced in the body and the brain prior to the conscious experience, which is why it's really useful to use a combination of tools from both traditional market research to user experience, UX research, and applied consumer neuroscience to really create that all-encompassing approach to analyzing that user experience and having the potential to create really, really insightful research. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about NeuroUX. What exactly is it? It's that measure of how someone feels when they are interacting with the system. And that system could really be anything from a software to a website to consumer products. Bob, do you want to speak a little bit more to why they should use NeuroUX?
Sure. Thank you, Kathryn. All right, so obviously, before I even get into that, I just wanted to talk about the relationship between IVP and HCD, just so everyone understands why we have a strategic partnership. We are data collection specialists, but when we get into collecting data that is way more sophisticated than we can even understand, we realized we needed to partner with a company that can interpret that data and report it. So we partnered with HCD, and they have neuroscientists on staff that can easily interpret the data that we hand off to them. So that's the process. We collect the data, we hand it off to them, and everyone involved can feel confident that the data is valid and it's being reported effectively. So that being said, the whole purpose of collecting neuro data is to uncover the non-conscious responses, right? And what that means is capturing brain activity in a lot of instances, along sometimes with biometrics. They can be independent of one another. They can be used at the same time. And we also might introduce other technologies like eye tracking. So the data collection is critical in the process to make sure we're collecting the data that we think is most useful to satisfying our clients' research objectives. So as you can see at the bottom of the screen here, the combined goals is to use the right tool for the right question, right? And quality data collection and data analysis and reporting is critical to the process, obviously. And I only say that because there's a lot of bad data out there. So you really need to be confident in the companies that you're working with. I feel confident in IVP's ability to capture and collect the data, and I feel confident in HCD's capability to analyze it, interpret it, and report it.
Absolutely. And There are a lot of neuro tools available. I know that with Bob's labs that he goes and fields with a lot of these tools, but each of these tools have unique abilities and really cool measurements, but it's important to recognize that not one tool is going to answer every single question. And that's a really important thing to consider, right, Bob?
That's correct. So, I mean, you see, we have facial coding here, we have eye tracking, we have facial EMG collecting the facial muscle activity, and we have EEG, right, collecting brain waves from participants. It's not a one size fits all type of scenario, right? Each one of these tools is specific to providing a certain type of data. So it's really important early on in the process that there's a meeting of the minds between HCD, IVP, and our clients, right? So before we even start off on a project, we all are in agreement that we have the right tool to satisfy the research objectives.
Right, exactly. And it's important to recognize that you can have every single fancy gadget in the entire world, but it doesn't actually mean anything if you're not using it correctly. So that's a really important message that we want to hone in on and focus on. But for today's purposes, as Bob was alluding to before, we are going to be focusing on one tool in particular, which is EEG. So what exactly is EEG? It's this tool that's really commonly used to record the brain synaptic waves and volts across the surfaces to examine brain functions and brain responses. And I'm going to let Bob talk a little bit about how that is placed on the scalp and how we're actually able to infer that information from the brain.
Right. And before I even get into that, you know why we call it EEG, right? If you can see what the entire name is, and I have a hard time just looking at it and saying it. It's electroencephalogram.
Try saying it 10 times fast.
So that's why I never say it. I always say EEG. So anyway, EEG is a headset that is worn by the respondents, right? So it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to apply the headset to each respondent, right? We have to make sure that the sensors on the EEG headset are making good contact with the scalp, and our software tells us if they are or aren't making good contact. There is a little fluid that gets put on each sensor. So as you can imagine, every person that comes in for a study has different types of hair. Now, I could easily say I am a perfect candidate for EEG. I am like the golden child for EEG. It takes like 5 minutes to put the cap on me and get everything ready to go. And I'm a little bit out of the norm. Me and Michael Jordan would be good candidates. But anyway, they come in, we put the headset on them. The software tells us, yes, we are seeing all of the electrodes. They are receiving the data from the electrical impulses from the brain and different parts of the scalp. And once we establish that, then we're good to go. The part of the process before we actually get to the data is we need to do some baseline adjustments. So that usually takes about 5 minutes. A respondent just go through a series of questions to make sure that the sensors and the data is sort of in conjunction with each other. Once we establish that baseline, then we're ready to go out and do the actual experiment.
Right, exactly. And what's really great about EEG, though, is that it's very compatible with other methods of measurement. So if you wanted to do maybe a one-on-one interview or something along those lines, that can easily be put into the protocol for the research. But yeah, it's also,
Kathryn, let me just interrupt 1 second.
Sure.
You know, Kathryn mentioned one-on-one. It is ideally suited for one-on-one research. You know, it would take a while to put headsets on 8 or 10 people. So, you know, typically it's one-on-one research.
Exactly. And there are a lot of benefits to EEG, one of them being that it is non-invasive, which is great because you can really get a feel for that natural process that can take place. And it's also really easily combined with other measures that we talked about earlier in the talk. And it gives us the chance to look at brain states such as cognition and emotion to get a better understanding of that user experience. This is something we're going to be touching on in the case study in just a little bit. And then along with that, there are some really interesting things with EEG and UX research where, you're trying to understand the emotional neurodrivers of behavior to really pinpoint pain points and look at what people are going through as they go through a website. So it also is really great for differentiating from competitors, going beyond that self-report by either comparing directly against a competitor or doing an A/B test. So let's say if McDonald's wanted to see how intuitive their app was or their interfaces, they could compare it directly against Burger King when somebody is trying to order from their menu. And this can really show where both sites either excel or maybe need a little bit more improvement. One of the other things that are really great is that the output also has an opportunity to optimize calls to action. So you can make things easier by finding and fixing the unpleasant areas to help people navigate and feel a little bit more comfortable with whatever task they're trying to complete. And finally, one of the really important things here is that the use of EEG also helps to harmonize across platforms. So it really does get at that emotional and cognitive experience of the person while they interact with the platform, so that you can really have an idea of keeping whatever affect you are trying to get at consistent, whether that be on a computer or on a tablet or on a phone. You are getting that same emotional output across all the platforms. Sorry. Great. And then, so finally, we just want to be focusing on optimizing the value of research with EEG and UX. And that really does come down to understanding cognitive and emotional drivers that cause people to think a bit more or maybe cause them to feel unpleasant. And you can do that by looking at the neural mechanisms with UX behaviors that let us really dive into the moment by moment responses to really see if they are good or bad, but you can do all that in context. Great. And so going forward, we're going to be talking now about the case study. And what I just shared was really what motivated us to look into the neural mechanisms of what drives behavior. Things like scheduling an appointment for your vaccine. And this research was run in May of 2021. So if you think back to that, it was run as an internal pilot study to understand exactly what happens when an individual signs up to receive their COVID-19 vaccine on two different interfaces. So one of them would be the CVS website, and then the other is actually on Rite Aid. So the vaccine adoption is still obviously a very timely topic, and this NeuroU research can be used as a way to understand the pain points of the process, but also to observe the experience in an uninterrupted way, in a way that something like an interview is unable to do. So since this is part of the natural process of what people are experiencing, we can actually identify specific spots that maybe the participant was demonstrating some type of a hesitation or some type of confusion. And this is really informative when you're trying to improve the website experience to be a little bit more pleasant for those who are trying to sign up for their COVID-19 vaccine shot, but also to avoid any friction that may cause unnecessary dropouts. All right, and for this research, we actually did use, as Bob mentioned before, we try to combine different neuro tools together along with behavioral coding. So we have both EEG and eye tracking as a way to analyze what the person is doing as they interact with the website. So this video here is showing the output for both the EEG headset as well as the eye tracking device to really give that in the moment reaction that tells if something is intuitive or if they had to think about something for a bit. And having this playback video is really helpful to look into exactly where the trouble areas are so the appropriate improvements can be made. And having this combination is really ideal for giving a comprehensive evaluation of the consumer experience, since it's non-invasively sharing the pathways that people naturally would be drawn to take. And this is really helpful in finding more robust and easier ways to explore. And it really offers the ability to, like I said before, behaviorally code the participants' actions. All right, so going into the case study itself, it's really important to stick the landing to really make sure that that landing page is able to accomplish what it wants for the task. And so for the 2 COVID-19 scheduling sites, they automatically, right from the landing page, had very different distinct approaches. And as you can see, the Rite Aid landing page has an easy to find banner on the top page where you are encouraging individuals to really stay updated on COVID-19. They really had that pop out with it being highlighted in with a green background, and it gives a very clear call to action. But when we look at the CVS website, this is an example of what we're seeing from the side of NeuroUX, that we're able to observe eye tracking along with the neural mechanisms right at the same time. But just to zoom in a little bit on exactly what the page looks like, the CVS landing page has a lot more text and it lacks a clear direction as to where to set up this appointment. And that emphasis is on actually the CVS's hashtag one step closer, rather than guiding any individual to schedule their first or second dose. So it clearly seems a little bit crowded, and that is going to impact the UX experience, as we're about to see. All right, so a really important part of UX work is making sure that the person doesn't actually have to think about what they're doing. It should be an intuitive process and really simple and streamlined for the person, which is not what was occurring on the CVS or necessarily the Rite Aid website. There was a bit of confusion that was created on the landing page, and it's reflected in the cognitive and emotional responses of the participant. Here we can look at some of the data from workload, which is really just looking at how hard the consumer had to think during the experience, as well as looking, as you can see on the right, at the frontal asymmetry, which represents how the consumer was feeling during this experience. And the increase in the emotional index actually represents negative effects. So now, by understanding this, we can take a look into these measures and the neural responses to better compare the experience. So with the first impression, clearly Rite Aid had a simpler process, and NeuroUX really teases out those differences. As you can see, the CVS landing page had greater workload in comparison to Rite Aid, which is indicative of more mental effort that was required to broach the task. The emotional index also had similar responses, but CVS was slightly higher. And for both sites, it is important to consider that the participant is probably still orienting to the page and had probably similar levels of motivation to complete that task at hand. But you can see that there already is starting to be differentiations between the two websites. And so another way that you can look at the data is really to see the data being compared across the entire experience. So here we see both experiences in their entirety, with blue being that emotional index that we talked about and orange being that cognitive workload. So the blue peaks show an increase in an emotional ratio, telling exactly where the negative responses are during the experience. This helps to show how different both experiences are, because we can truly pinpoint where exactly those neural responses are occurring. And so we did just that. For the two websites we were looking at the experiences for, there were areas that had increased emotional ratios that exposed the negative events through these peaks. So for example, one of the major differentiators was when there was no CVS appointments available in the participant's desired state. This frustration is reflected in the emotional state, in the emotional index, with a major negative emotional spike occurring, as you can see on the left. And reviewing the responses of this suggests that there was some type of a shock to the participant. So you could go to CVS and recommend maybe to the website designer that you want to consider making some type of a visual signal to communicate that there is limited options. So you would suggest something like possibly graying out the states that were limited in their appointment availability. But it wasn't just CVS that was struggling to have a seamless COVID-19 scheduling experience, Rite Aid also had areas with heightened negative effects, such as when the respondent had to fill out if they qualified for the COVID-19 vaccine. Seeing that there is more activity in specific spots through these peaks in the graphs actually help to isolate areas that need to be revisited and further discussed because it needs further improvement. At this time, like I said, this occurred in May of 2021. So we were still in the stages where the vaccine rollout was not available to everybody. So it's understandable why there was a little bit of negative effect that was occurring as the person was trying to find out if they actually qualified for this. But it is something important to consider when trying to design for this website. All right, and so now that we had all of this data about the two workflows and the emotional reactions, how can we actually take them and make actionable next steps for either Rite Aid or for CVS? So for CVS, we saw all of these problem areas in the NeuroUX data and in the eye tracking, where respondents got tripped up in different points. These spots showed where things are not as clear as they would be to the respondent, and they didn't really know how they could complete their task. So we can take those specific points and tell CVS, for example, that in the beginning, the users were having difficulty from the start, causing them to have a little bit of frustration already and increased mental workload built up, which is going to impact the rest of their experience. So having this nice, clear call to action is something that they should consider when trying to help guide the participant and simplify the process. Next, we saw that the respondent had issues with finding a state where the vaccine was available, and going through that whole process again was really challenging, scrolling through and finding that there was no luck in finding a store. So again, if we could make that more apparent by graying it out and giving a visual cue, that could help make the whole experience easier to navigate. But finally, we see through these forms you see through going through these forms to fill out that the CVS had a longer process. It was actually more than 4 minutes longer than Rite Aid's. So by simplifying that process with these tools and streamlining it to help with the NeuroUX to understand where people were having a hard time, we could go back and clean up those spots to make the time to completion quicker and cut out any extra steps that, Rite Aid had over CVS, because Rite Aid had 2 less steps than the CVS pharmacy. So by finding spots to streamline and make it simpler, hopefully that would decrease the mental workload and improve the emotional index for the entire process when comparing CVS versus Rite Aid. But additionally, Rite Aid's not off the hook. There was obviously areas that Rite Aid could have improvement as well. So they would have benefited from NeuroUX as well, because they can take that information and really pinpoint those specific areas that need improvement on their own site. And you can take the NeuroUX to make informed recommendations about key areas that need a little bit more attention and can improve that overall workflow. So in using neuro tools in combination with these insights from behavioral coding and traditional metrics from UX, we can actually give that overall idea of the user experience and color it with some deeper insights from NeuroUX. All right, and finally, this combination of various tools is a very modern approach to understanding the user experience, because again, it doesn't interrupt or take that person out of the moment. And that allows us to see where their intuition takes them and find out what paths that are more efficient or less efficient by observing things like workload and seeing how hard they had to think about navigating a website. This process also was really helpful in trying to figure out the right emotional experience that's occurring and make sure that it fit the molds of whatever that website designer or marketer is trying to achieve. So in taking a look at all of these pieces together, we can actually have a better understanding of any of the user experiences, factoring in all of these differences when analyzing the overall experience really does help to differentiate good and bad UX. And especially in this instance, it can be the difference between somebody actually signing up for their vaccine or somebody giving up. But keeping all those things in mind, we are happy to take some Q&As. I know that there is a lot that was unpacked here, so we're happy to chat a little bit more about it.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for sticking around for this last presentation of the day. We do have some questions here, but please feel free to add any of yours as well. One question here is, do you do any of this analysis live?
I don't believe, I'll let Bob handle this one, but I don't believe we do, because when you're thinking about NeuroUX data, there actually is a very intense cleaning process that has to be considered. And the brain is so complex. So there is a lot of things that are occurring that you want to make sure you account for. I know Bob probably has some horror stories of people sneezing constantly during, the.
Yeah, Bob, it looked like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I would say there is no real-time analysis. And as much as clients like to see real-time feedback, and we do give them some visual references so they could say, oh, this looks really cool, but we make it clear that they shouldn't really interpret what they're seeing, because that data needs to be filtered, it needs to be cleaned up. There's a lot of things that have to happen behind the scenes, and you don't want to jump to conclusions in real time that are not going to really translate after the analysis is completed. So the answer is no.
And kind of in line with that, when you're talking about putting multiple metrics together, whether it's within using EEG or whether it's adding EEG to some of the other measures you might be doing with survey or interview or whatever it might be, what do you do and how do you weight things? Are you thinking that in this case that the workload is more important, or that the emotional valence is more important, or, how do you incorporate in the self-report?
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing real quick, Michelle. I'm sorry. We showed example of eye tracking along with EEG, right? I was really referring to the EEG data analysis. The eye tracking, on the top level, you're not really analyzing it, you're just observing it, right? So you could see where someone's looking or not looking. And if their eye is like fixating on a specific spot, they might be confused or whatever. So that's useful, on the top level. But the real data that gets analyzed is not really useful in real time.
Sure.
Absolutely. And talking a bit about what that question was, going back to it, it's important to think about the research question and deciding what tools you want to use with it, because it's very dependent on whatever you're looking at. So if there is something that is requiring a lot of workload, you're going to focus on that and see if maybe, if somebody has to build furniture. I just moved, I was building furniture nonstop. If, that required a different type of workload compared to another thing. So you want to keep things in context and consider what is your research question, and then go forward and look at what metrics
I think also
are important.
To get to that question where they're asking about how do you choose to weight these, that they don't answer the same questions, right? So keeping that in mind, and that can really help drive that decision making. One final question, because I know we're already over time, and I want to make sure to invite everybody to join us tomorrow as well. So we do look forward to seeing you tomorrow and continuing the conversation. But there are a lot of different headsets out there. There's new ones, there's expensive ones, there's cheaper ones, and I know we had a bit of this conversation yesterday. But what are your thoughts on some of the new devices that are out there?
Well, again, I'm not saying that, the less expensive headsets are not as good. They're just collecting less data, right? So the headset we showed you in the picture had 24 electrodes, right? So obviously we're collecting a lot of data from a person's scalp, right? As opposed to a headset that might only have 4 electrodes on it, right? So obviously they both could be useful, but you have to understand the limitations of one versus the other. So if you're trying to answer a certain question, maybe you need a 24 electrode type of headset to help you do that. So, they're both good, but they both have specific, reasons why they're used in particular instances.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bob and Kathryn. I think this is a great presentation. If you missed any of it, we will be uploading it shortly. And so feel free to share it with your friends that may be interested as well. Otherwise, really looking forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And we will have the final day tomorrow with some networking opportunities. So please feel free to join us then. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.